Once upon a time, in a palace dripping with gold and lies, a boy grew up surrounded by everything a prince could want, except truth. His name was Abijah, and he lived in a house where prayers were whispered to idols, bribes clinked across polished floors, and the name of the Lord was used only when it was convenient. His father, King Rehoboam, had once followed the God of Israel, but power has a way of making even good men slippery. And Rehoboam had long since traded obedience for control. By the time Abijah was old enough to walk the halls, the kingdom of Judah was already divided, broken apart by greed, pride, and bad religion. He watched his cousins bow to golden statues in secret rooms. He listened as palace guards joked about cheating the poor. He heard his own father say, "Don't worry what the prophets say. Just do what keeps the throne steady." And in the middle of all that darkness, Abijah prayed. Not loudly, not perfectly, but faithfully. He'd find empty rooms, closets behind tapestries, the cool silence of the roof at midnight, and he would speak to the God his father had forgotten. Because somewhere deep inside, Abijah knew something no one else seemed to remember. God sees everything, and he hears those who speak to him, even in the shadows. Years passed. And then far too soon, Abijah became king. Not because he was ready, but because Rehoboam's heart gave out one bitter winter after a feast filled with too much wine and too little peace. The palace mourned publicly, but privately? They scrambled. Generals whispered. Advisors panicked, and Abijah, just a young man, stood alone in a crooked house with a crooked past, now expected to rule. It would have been easier to keep pretending, easier to keep up the mask, to make deals, to follow his father's pattern of compromise. But God had kept his eyes on Abijah even when no one else had, and now it was time to stand. The first real test came fast, like storms always do. A scout ran breathless into the palace one morning. "King Jeroboam of Israel is marching toward us with 800,000 men." An old priest, one of the few who still feared the Lord, met Abijah on the ridge above the valley of Zemaraim. The wind whipped across the rocks as the army of Judah, small, frightened, and undertrained, gathered behind him. Abijah looked out over the valley. Jeroboam's troops filled the fields like a dark tide. "They think we're weak," he muttered. "They're not entirely wrong," the priest said gently. Abijah didn't argue. But then he stepped up to the edge of the cliff, raised his voice, and shouted down into the wind, "Listen to me, Jeroboam! Listen, Israel! You have numbers, but we have the Lord. You cast out his priests. You made idols. You worship goats, but we worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he will fight for us today." His army held its breath. Even the wind paused. Then a low rumble. Thunder? Or something deeper? Abijah turned to his men, his voice steady. "We were born in a house of lies, but that's not where we're staying." He drew his sword. "Today we fight not just for Judah, but for the honor of the Lord." The soldiers stood taller, and somewhere above, in clouds thick with justice, God was watching. Because even in a wicked house, even in the shadows of a broken past, God sees the one who still belongs to him, and Abijah was about to prove it. The sun hadn't fully risen when the army of Judah took their positions. Abijah stood tall in his armor, polished but slightly too big, while the priest beside him whispered a prayer only God could hear. Behind them, the soldiers shuffled nervously, clutching spears and swords passed down from grandfathers. Farmers, shepherds, craftsmen. Most had never even seen war, let alone fought one. And ahead of them, a wall of warriors from Israel dressed in iron and confidence. Then came the sound. Drums from Jeroboam's camp. The ground seemed to vibrate as ranks of soldiers marched forward. Their shields gleamed in the early light. Their eyes were hard, and Abijah could feel his own heart pound louder than the enemy's drums. A captain jogged up beside him. "Your Majesty, they've split their forces. Half are sneaking behind us." Abijah didn't flinch, but the priest paled. "They want to trap us," the priest whispered. "Let them," Abijah replied. "The Lord sees every trap." Jeroboam was a clever man. He had taken 10 tribes, built his own temples, and crowned himself king when he thought God had forgotten David's line. He stood now on the opposite ridge, watching with a cruel smile. "This will be quick," he muttered to one of his generals. "One shout, and Judah will run." But Judah didn't run. Instead, Abijah turned to his army, his hands raised high, and shouted, "Blow the trumpets!" The sound pierced the valley like lightning splitting the sky, and something changed. Not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the people. The fear that had once curled in their stomachs turned into something else, something older and stronger: faith. The priest stepped forward, singing ancient songs as they marched with the ark. The people shouted, the horns blasted, the wind picked up, and then, just as Jeroboam's forces moved in from behind, the enemy stumbled. A rockslide cracked down the cliffs. Hornets swarmed from a nearby grove. A blinding gust swept through the valley, scattering dust and leaves and plans alike. Judah struck hard and fast, their swords shining like fire. Men who had never touched a blade fought like lions, and by the end of the day, Jeroboam's army had scattered like dry leaves before a storm. The battle was over, and Judah had won. But Abijah didn't rejoice. He sat on the battlefield at sunset, blood on his robe, eyes staring at the broken helmets and abandoned spears that dotted the grass like graves. "We won," said one soldier, grinning as he sat beside him. Abijah didn't look up. "Did we?" The priest sat down on his other side, gently placing a hand on the young king's shoulder. "This wasn't just about numbers. This was about loyalty. You didn't just fight Jeroboam. You took a stand for God." Abijah nodded slowly. "But there's more to fix than a battlefield." "Yes," the priest agreed, "but today was the beginning." That night, the people celebrated in the streets of Jerusalem. Torches lit every corner. Musicians played until their fingers hurt. Children waved banners stitched with lions and trumpets. But Abijah stood at the palace window looking out. He remembered the idols still tucked in corners of homes. He remembered the way some of the elders flinched at the name of the Lord, as if afraid to hope again. He knew one victory couldn't wash away years of compromise. But he also knew something else. God had shown up. Not because Judah was strong, not because he was perfect, but because Abijah had dared to speak truth in the face of lies. And God always honors the heart that still seeks him, even in a family full of shadows. The battlefield had emptied. The enemy had fled. But the real war? It had only just begun. Abijah sat in the king's chamber, with his cloak still stained from the valley. He hadn't changed yet. Something about the smell of smoke and sweat and dirt helped him remember what they were fighting for, and what they still needed to face. Outside, the sound of celebration roared through the streets, people dancing, shouting, singing praises to the God of Judah. But Abijah's heart was quiet. He looked over the scrolls spread out on the table, maps of Judah, temple records, and lists of towns where idols were still being worshipped in secret, towns where the people bent their knees to Baal or lit incense to Asherah when no one was watching. He dragged his fingers through his curls and leaned back. "I won the battle," he whispered to himself, "but my father's shadow still sits on the throne." A soft knock. Then the priest entered, his robes dusty, eyes kind. "I brought news from the southern villages," he said. "Abijah stood." "And?" "Some still light fires to false gods," the priest replied. "Some bow to wood and stone." Abijah's jaw tightened. Did they not hear what just happened in the valley? "They heard," the priest said gently, "but fear runs deeper than faith for many, and old habits take root like weeds." The young king stepped toward the window. Below, the people were waving banners. Children chased each other through the palace gardens. There was laughter in the city again, and yet there was poison under the surface. "We must cleanse the land," Abijah said, more to himself than anyone else. "But not just with swords." The priest raised an eyebrow. "Then how?" Abijah turned slowly, his voice firmer now. "We will begin with truth. We will rebuild the altar of the Lord, not just the one in the temple, but in the hearts of the people." The priest's lips curved into a quiet smile. "Then may God strengthen your hand." The next day, a decree went out. No more idols, no more secret shrines, no more offerings to carved stones or wooden poles hidden in back gardens. And then Abijah did something bold. He took down the idol his father had kept in the garden behind the palace, with his own hands. Servants gasped. Elders watched in frozen silence. The statue cracked in half with a single swing of his blade. Dust flew, and something in the air shifted. Not everyone clapped. Some whispered, some trembled. But others began to weep. Because for the first time in years, truth was not just spoken, it was lived. That night Abijah walked the halls alone. He paused before the room that had once belonged to Rehoboam. It smelled faintly of wine and old cedar. He pushed open the door. The room was dark, but the moonlight spilled across the bed, the throne chair, the wall of maps. And there, on a shelf above his father's study table, was a small gold idol, polished, hidden, a leftover. Abijah stared at it for a long time. Then he reached up, took it down, and held it in his hands. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it outside, into the garden, past the torches, past the whispering leaves, and with one throw he cast it into the fire pit where flames danced and swallowed what should never have been kept. Behind him, the wind picked up, and Abijah whispered softly into the dark, "I am not my father." The battlefield was strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your stomach twist, like the sky itself is holding its breath. Abijah stood on the rocky ridge overlooking the valley. His army was half the size of Jeroboam's. Some of his soldiers were shaking, some were whispering prayers, others just stared in silence at the sea of enemy troops below. And then, the trap was revealed. "Your Majesty," a scout cried, racing up the ridge, face pale. "We're surrounded. They've circled behind us in the night. Jeroboam has troops on both sides." Gasps spread through Judah's ranks like wildfire. Abijah's men turned left and right, watching enemy banners rise from the trees like wolves baring their teeth. "Are we going to die?" one young soldier whispered, eyes wide with fear. No, Abijah said firmly. Not today. He looked up at the sky, not out of habit, but because he truly believed someone was watching. He turned to the priest standing beside him, an older Levite named Zadok, who had remained loyal to the Lord even when others had bowed to idols. Sound the trumpets, Abijah said quietly. Zadok blinked. Now? Yes, right now. Let them hear our faith before they see our swords. With trembling hands, Zadok lifted the silver trumpets, symbols of God's covenant with his people, and blew. The sound rang out like thunder. Down in the valley, Jeroboam heard the horns. He laughed. They think a trumpet will save them? He sneered to his commanders. Let them play music. We'll play war. But what Jeroboam didn't understand was this. That trumpet wasn't just sound. It was a declaration. It said, we belong to the Lord. It said, we remember who we are. It said, God fights for us. Back on the ridge, Abijah raised his sword high. Men of Judah, he cried, we are not standing alone today. The God of our fathers, the one who brought us out of Egypt, who split the sea and shattered walls, is with us now. A murmur spread through the ranks like courage returning to tired bones. We may be fewer in number, he shouted, but we are greater in heart, and I would rather fall with honor than live in fear. His soldiers lifted their weapons. They roared, not because they were stronger, but because they finally believed they were not fighting alone. And as Jeroboam's army closed in, something shifted. The ground trembled. The sky, which had been cloudy all morning, suddenly split with light. Thunder cracked. Wind howled through the hills like 1,000 chariots. And in the chaos, some said they saw it, a blinding figure, a warrior not made of flesh, standing behind Judah's army, sword drawn. Later, the scribes would call it a miracle. Jeroboam's army collapsed that day, not from numbers, but from fear and confusion. Men dropped their weapons and ran. Others cried out to gods that didn't answer. Some just fell, unable to explain the terror in their bones. By sunset, Judah stood victorious. 800,000 had marched against them. Only God could explain what happened next. That night, Abijah didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a feast or wear a crown. He sat alone beneath the stars, dust on his robe, sword resting beside him. Zadok approached quietly. You saved us. No, Abijah said. God did. I just refused to stay silent. Zadok smiled gently. You spoke like a king today. I spoke like a servant, Abijah whispered, and that's who I'll keep being. Because deep down, Abijah knew something the other kings forgot. Victory isn't just about winning battles. It's about remembering who fights them for you. The fire still burned in the courtyard pit. A thick column of smoke drifted upward, curling into the night sky like a signal, one not sent to men, but to heaven itself. But inside the palace, not everyone was rejoicing. Abijah had torn down the idols. He had cleansed the royal garden. He had spoken truth in the public square. And now, the palace whispered back. It started quietly. A steward delayed his orders. A cousin failed to attend a council meeting. One of the elders scoffed in a hallway, just loud enough to be heard, "He's young. He'll tire of this righteousness." Abijah heard it all, and worse, he felt it. There were still rooms in the palace where golden trinkets remained hidden under floorboards, still chambers where Rehoboam's wine sat untouched beside altars that hadn't been removed. He had changed the banners. He had changed the laws. But he hadn't yet changed the hearts. That would take something more. "Do you trust them?" asked Makkah, his grandmother, one evening as she strolled beside him in the upper gardens. Abijah said nothing. He simply watched the wind tug at the tall trees lining the hill. Below, Jerusalem shimmered like a bowl of gold and stone. Makkah raised her eyebrows. "You're too bold," she said softly. "Too loud. The people were fine. Your father kept peace by letting them mix the old with the new, a little Baal, a little Yahweh. No harm done." Abijah turned to her, his eyes steady. "There's no peace when people lie to themselves." Makkah's face darkened. "Be careful what you tear down, grandson. Not every wall was built by evil hands." And with that, she walked away, her long cloak trailing behind her like a shadow that wouldn't let go. Later that week, Abijah met with the priests and Levites in the southern court. He stood before them, not just as a king, but as a man desperate to rebuild what sin had ruined. "I don't want empty rituals," he told them. "I want truth in the temple. I want songs sung with hearts on fire. I want prayers that rise like thunder to God's ears." An older Levite stepped forward, his hands wrinkled, his voice thick with years. "Then lead us there, King, not with swords, but with steps." Abijah nodded slowly. It was time for something deeper. In the weeks that followed, Abijah launched a campaign no one expected, not one of conquest, but of revival. He walked through the streets in plain robes. He ate with the poor. He visited the broken-down altars and knelt there in prayer, not as a king, but as a servant. One morning, as he knelt outside a small village shrine once desecrated by idol worship, an old woman approached him with trembling hands. "You are not like your father," she said. He looked up. "No," Abijah whispered, "but I carry the same name, and I must clean what he left behind." The woman bowed low. "Then may the Lord bless you, my king. May he never turn his face from you." But not everyone was pleased. Makkah, still holding power in the royal court, began gathering the old families to her side, the ones loyal to Rehoboam's way of ruling, the ones afraid that too much righteousness might stir the wrong spirits. One night, Abijah's captain rushed into his chamber. "My lord," he said breathless, "there's talk of a secret feast. Your grandmother, your father's men, they've invited priests of Asherah." Abijah stood. A silence settled over the room. Then he walked to the window, staring out into the starlit garden below. "They think I'll ignore it," he said quietly. "But they've forgotten something." The captain looked up. "What's that?" Abijah turned to him. "I serve a God who sees everything, even what's done in the dark." He strapped on his royal sash. Then he whispered, "And this house will be cleansed." The valley of Zemaraim lay quiet now. Smoke drifted from abandoned fires. Swords lay scattered like broken promises. The bodies of the fallen were being gathered, not for glory, but for mercy. Abijah walked through the battlefield with his head uncovered and his heart heavy. His royal cloak dragged through the dust, but he didn't care. A king should never forget what war costs. Zadok followed behind, his steps slow. "They'll sing songs about today," Zadok said softly. Abijah shook his head. "Let them sing to the Lord, not me." They reached the center of the field where the altar had been set up, a simple stone table. No gold, no carvings, just truth. Abijah knelt and placed a lamb upon it, an offering for mercy, not pride. He raised his voice, not for the people, but for God. "You saw me in the dark," he prayed, "when I was just a boy hiding behind the tapestries, whispering your name. You heard me when no one else believed, and today you fought for us." He paused. "I don't deserve this crown, but if you want me to wear it, I'll wear it for you." Zadok placed fire to the altar. Flames rose, not with violence, but with peace. And the people began to gather behind them, watching their king not as a warrior, but as a worshiper. Later that night, back in the palace, a feast was prepared. But Abijah didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat in the middle of the people, between soldiers, servants, and shepherds. "Tell me your stories," he said. One soldier, with a bandaged arm, leaned in. "I was ready to run, but then I saw you standing at the edge of the cliff, shouting at the wind, and I thought, if a king can be that brave, maybe I could be too." A servant girl nodded. "We didn't need another loud king. We needed a true one." Abijah didn't know what to say, because he hadn't felt strong. He had just obeyed, and somehow that was enough. But in the corners of the room, not everyone was smiling. Old officials from Rehoboam's reign whispered behind their goblets, "He's too soft. He speaks of God too much. He'll undo everything we've built." Abijah noticed, but he said nothing, because he had learned something in the valley. Not all enemies carry swords. Some carry scrolls and wear robes and speak in careful tones. But he also knew something else. As long as God's fire was still on the altar, he had nothing to fear. That night, after the feast, Abijah walked the palace halls alone. He stopped before a small locked door, one he hadn't opened in years. His father's idol room. He pulled the key from around his neck, took a deep breath, and turned the lock. The door creaked open slowly, revealing golden images, incense trays, and false altars. Abijah stepped inside. He didn't tremble. He didn't rage. He just whispered, "This ends now." And one by one, he began to tear them down. With each crash, the echoes of the past trembled. Because the house of Rehoboam might have been built on compromise. But the house of Abijah would be built on something else. Long after the palace had gone to sleep, Abijah stayed awake. Ash clung to his sleeves from the torn-down idols. Pieces of gold lay in splinters in the hallway, but he didn't call the servants to clean it up. Let the mess remain, for now. It was a reminder that something sacred was shifting. The next morning, Zadok entered the royal chamber with wide eyes. You tore it all down." Abijah didn't look up. The room should have never been there. Zadok walked carefully over the cracked gold face of a forgotten god. "There's still one more," he said, lowering his voice. "One more room, the secret one." Abijah turned sharply. "What room?" Zadok hesitated. "Your father. He had it built beneath the east tower. No guards, no records, just silence." Without another word, Abijah stood. "Show me." They crept through narrow stairways hidden behind thick stone walls. Dust whispered under their sandals. The air changed, colder, heavier, as they moved deeper. At last, Zadok pushed open a rotting wooden door. The hinges groaned as if even they were reluctant to see what lay beyond. It was a vault. Dark, silent, cursed. Torches flickered along the walls, revealing treasures looted from foreign temples, statues of gods with twisted eyes, scrolls written in tongues Israel was never meant to speak, and a mirror lined with obsidian and snakes. Abijah stepped inside. Each breath felt like a weight on his chest. "No wonder the kingdom cracked," he muttered. Zadok swallowed hard. "This room isn't just full of sin, Abijah. It's full of memory." And Abijah knew what he meant. How many kings had bowed here in secret? How many leaders had burned incense to the gods of their enemies? Abijah looked at the mirror. For a moment, it showed him nothing but his reflection. And then it shifted. A version of himself stared back, wearing a gold robe, holding a staff of power, surrounded by adoring crowds. He blinked. The vision was gone. He turned away fast. "Burn it!" Zadok gasped. "All of it! All of it!" Abijah said. "Every false god, every cursed scroll, every image of glory not rooted in God." The torches flared as Zadok began to light the offerings. The room screamed in silence as centuries of darkness turned to smoke. Abijah didn't flinch. He didn't flee. He watched. And as the last statue cracked, a rush of wind swept through the vault like a sigh of relief from heaven itself. That night, the stars over Judah seemed brighter. Abijah stood on the roof of the palace, looking out over his kingdom. The city breathed differently now, lighter, cleaner. But something still stirred in his spirit. A restlessness. Zadok joined him, holding 2 cups of water. "Most kings are satisfied after a battle and a bonfire," he joked. Abijah didn't laugh. "I want more," he said. "More land?" Zadok asked. "Number." "More truth." Zadok looked confused. Abijah continued. "I want the people to know God for themselves, not just follow because I lead them. I want the children in the streets to know His name. I want the widows and the workers to feel His love." He paused. "I want this kingdom to remember what covenant means." Zadok stared at him for a long time, then smiled. "You're not like your father." Abijah took a sip of water. That's the whole point. The silence didn't last long. Barely a week after the burning of the secret vault, whispers began drifting through the halls like smoke through cracks. "Have you heard?" a servant whispered to another behind the water jugs. "The nobles from Ephraim didn't bow during the last gathering." "I heard Abijah refused to sign the trade treaty," murmured a scribe near the olive storerooms. "They say he wants to undo everything his father built." The tension was no longer hidden. It pulsed through the palace like a fever. Abijah stood in the war room, staring at a wooden table marked with stone figures, 12 for the tribes, 1 broken in 2. "They don't understand yet," he said, running his fingers along the jagged line between Judah and Israel. "But righteousness will always feel like rebellion to those who love their sin." Zadok entered with a scroll, this time an honest one. "It's confirmed. A small force from Israel has crossed into our borders near Bethel. No direct attack, but they're watching." Abijah didn't panic. He nodded slowly. "Let them watch. Maybe they'll see something holy." That afternoon, he called an assembly, not just of soldiers or priests, but of the people. Men with tired hands, women with eyes like dried rivers, children who'd only heard of David in bedtime songs. Abijah stood on the palace steps without a crown, without royal robes, just a plain tunic, dusty from the courtyard. "I know what you've heard," he began, "that I'm tearing down old ways, that I'm too young, that I've made enemies." The crowd shifted. "But let me tell you what I really did," he said. His voice grew firmer. "I destroyed the idols my father let into the palace. I burned the secret gods of our past. And I stood on a ridge with nothing but faith and faced Jeroboam's army, and we won." He pointed toward the temple in the distance, its gold roof glowing in the sun. "But it wasn't me who gave us victory. It was the Lord." He stepped down onto the ground, face to face with the people. "I don't want to be a king with secrets. I want to be a servant with truth." A quiet murmur rolled through the crowd, then silence. Then a voice. A young woman near the front. "My son is sick," she said. "The priests used to charge silver to pray." Abijah looked at her, eyes steady. "Bring him tomorrow. The priests won't charge anything again, not while I'm king." Then an old man raised his hand. "Will you tear down the altar at Gibeon too, the one your father offered to Baal?" Abijah paused. "Yes, and I'll do it myself." One by one, heads nodded, shoulders straightened. Faith isn't always loud, but it is contagious. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Abijah walked the halls of the palace, alone, until he heard it, faint music coming from a side room once used for drinking and gambling. He pushed the door open, and there he saw something that stopped him. A circle of children singing. Not to Baal, not to Asherah, but to the God of Israel. Simple songs, off-key, clumsy rhythm, but every word lifted like incense. Abijah leaned against the doorframe and whispered, "Let this be the legacy. Not wealth, not war, but worship." The next morning, the palace returned to motion, but something had changed. The servants stepped lighter. The soldiers polished their armor with pride. Even the courtyard seemed brighter, as if Judah itself was taking a breath it didn't know it had held. But not everyone welcomed the change. Deep within the walls of the inner court, a group of advisors gathered in hushed tones. Men who had sat at Rehoboam's side, who had grown rich from bribes, who had never learned the weight of integrity. They wore fine robes, spoke with smooth tongues, smiled in public, but behind closed doors, they planned. "This boy is dangerous," one muttered, his ringed fingers clenched around a goblet. "He wants to pull up everything we built by the roots. He's too bold, too clean. He's ruining our alliances." They leaned over a silver map etched into the table's surface, one piece in particular, Egypt. "If we convince Pharaoh that Abijah is threatening the trade routes," whispered another, "he'll act. He always does, when coin is in question." A final voice spoke, low and icy. "Then let the boy king find out what it means to be surrounded." Later that week, Abijah stood on the palace balcony as a strange silence swept the horizon. Not the holy kind, the threatening kind. Zadok ran up the stairs, face pale. Pharaoh is on the move. Abijah blinked. "Egypt? Why?" "He says you're planning to cut off the southern trade road." "I never said that." "No," Zadok said grimly. But someone did, and they said it in your name." Abijah turned and looked over the city of Jerusalem, its people walking calmly beneath the sky. "They don't know yet, do they?" "No." "Good," Abijah said, quietly. "They deserve a day more of peace." That night, Abijah went alone to the temple. He didn't ask the priest to come. He didn't dress in royal garments, just him and the altar. He knelt beside it, resting one hand on the cold stone. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't know who's plotting or where the arrows will fly from next." He swallowed hard. "But I do know this. You raised me up in a crooked house. You gave me breath when no one else believed I'd matter. So if this is the moment I was born for, don't let me flinch." Behind him, footsteps echoed. Zadok again. "Should I gather the generals?" Abijah rose, slow but certain. "Yes, and this time we won't wait for the enemy to reach our gates." The next morning, a royal decree spread across Judah, not of fear, not of retreat, but of faith. "Any man who still believes in the Lord," the scroll read, "meet me at the southern ridge. Bring no idols, speak no lies. We will fight, not just for Judah, but for the honor of the name above every name." And as the sun rose, Judah's faithful rose with it, farmers, craftsmen, priests, sons, not perfect men, but willing ones. And high on the ridge, where shadows couldn't reach, Abijah stood, eyes toward Egypt, sword at his side, faith in his heart. Because when you've been raised in darkness, and God still calls you his, you don't hide when trouble comes, you stand. Ince didn't last long. Barely a week after the burning of the secret vault, whispers began drifting through the halls like smoke through cracks. "Have you heard?" a servant whispered to another behind the water jugs. "The nobles from Ephraim didn't bow during the last gathering." "I heard Abijah refused to sign the trade treaty," murmured a scribe near the olive storerooms. "They say he wants to undo everything his father built." The tension was no longer hidden. It pulsed through the palace like a fever. Abijah stood in the war room, staring at a wooden table marked with stone figures, 12 for the tribes, 1 broken in 2. "They don't understand yet," he said, running his fingers along the jagged line between Judah and Israel. "But righteousness will always feel like rebellion to those who love their sin." Zadok entered with a scroll, this time an honest one. "It's confirmed. A small force from Israel has crossed into our borders near Bethel. No direct attack, but they're watching." Abijah didn't panic. He nodded slowly. "Let them watch. Maybe they'll see something holy." That afternoon, he called an assembly, not just of soldiers or priests, but of the people. Men with tired hands, women with eyes like dried rivers, children who'd only heard of David in bedtime songs. Abijah stood on the palace steps, without a crown, without royal robes, just a plain tunic dusty from the courtyard. "I know what you've heard," he began, "that I'm tearing down old ways, that I'm too young, that I've made enemies." The crowd shifted. "But let me tell you what I really did," he said. His voice grew firmer. "I destroyed the idols my father let into the palace. I burned the secret gods of our past. And I stood on a ridge with nothing but faith and faced Jeroboam's army, and we won." He pointed toward the temple in the distance, its gold roof glowing in the sun. "But it wasn't me who gave us victory. It was the Lord." He stepped down onto the ground face to face with the people, I don't want to be a king with secrets. I want to be a servant with truth. A quiet murmur rolled through the crowd, then silence, then a voice, a young woman near the front. "My son is sick," she said. "The priest used to charge silver to pray." Abijah looked at her, eyes steady. "Bring him tomorrow. The priests won't charge anything again, not while I'm king." Then an old man raised his hand. "Will you tear down the altar at Gibeon too, the one your father offered to Baal?" Abijah paused. "Yes, and I'll do it myself." One by one, heads nodded, shoulders straightened. Faith isn't always loud, but it is contagious. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Abijah walked the halls of the palace, alone, until he heard it, faint music coming from a side room once used for drinking and gambling. He pushed the door open, and there he saw something that stopped him. A circle of children singing, not to Baal, not to Asherah, but to the God of Israel. Simple songs, off-key, clumsy rhythm, but every word lifted like incense. Abijah leaned against the doorframe and whispered, "Let this be the legacy. Not wealth, not war, but worship." The army of Judah gathered at dawn. Not in perfect formation, not dressed in shining armor, but they came. Boots wrapped in leather and faith, cloaks smelling of fields and firewood, eyes wide but steady. Some had never held a sword. Some had lost fathers to Rehoboam's bad treaties. Some had almost stopped believing, until Abijah stood up and reminded them that God still watches. Now they stood behind their king. Abijah walked the front line slowly, speaking to every cluster of men one by one. "We're not just defending a city," he said to a group of farmers gripping pitchforks. "We're defending the truth that our God is not made of silver or stone." He passed two brothers with slings and looked them in the eye. "You were born for more than fear." To an old priest, who had brought nothing but a walking staff and a prayer shawl, he whispered, "Today is not about power, it's about presence." When he reached Zadok, he nodded. "Are the scouts in place?" Zadok pointed toward the horizon. "We've spotted movement near the trade route. It's Pharaoh's men. They've split their army, half heading north, the other sweeping south." Abijah clenched his jaw. "They're trying to trap us." Zadok added, "And there's word from inside the palace. The old advisors have fled. Some say they carried gold with them." Abijah exhaled. "Cowards will always find a way out, but we'll find our way through." He turned to the men gathered on the ridge. The valley below shimmered with heat, but also with danger. Clouds of dust marked the enemy's approach. "Judah!" he shouted. The men turned. "This is the place where truth stands up to fear. Pharaoh has chariots, but we have the Lord. Egypt has gold, but we have our God. They come with force, but we come with faith." A loud shout rose from the ranks, not polished, not rehearsed, but real. And then came the moment of stillness before battle, the hush between heaven and earth where choices are measured. Zadok whispered, "We're outnumbered 3-1. Abijah didn't blink. "Good." "Good?" Abijah's voice dropped into a steady rhythm. "If we win, they'll say it was tactics. If we survive, they'll say it was chance. But if we stand, if we hold, if we fight, they'll have to say it was God." Then, as the sun reached the edge of the sky, the enemy crested the hill. Horns sounded. Metal flashed. The battle had begun. Spears clashed, dust flew, men cried out. Abijah fought like a man with nothing to lose, but everything to prove. He shouted scripture over the roar. He called men by name when they faltered. He moved not like a king commanding servants, but like a servant trusting his king. And somewhere in the fray, as the enemy began to press harder, a strange wind picked up. The enemy's horses reared, the dust turned sideways, and thunder cracked over a cloudless sky. Zadok looked up, eyes wide. "That wasn't our horn." "No," Abijah said, sword raised. "That was heaven reminding them who really commands the battle." And with a final cry, Judah surged forward. The next morning, the palace returned to motion, but something had changed. The servants stepped lighter. The soldiers polished their armor with pride. Even the courtyard seemed brighter, as if Judah itself was taking a breath it didn't know it had held, but not everyone welcomed the change. Deep within the walls of the inner court, a group of advisors gathered in hushed tones. Men who had sat at Rehoboam's side, who had grown rich from bribes, who had never learned the weight of integrity. They wore fine robes, spoke with smooth tongues, smiled in public, but behind closed doors, they planned. "This boy is dangerous," one muttered, his ringed fingers clenched around a goblet. "He wants to pull up everything we built, by the roots. He's too bold, too clean. He's ruining our alliances." They leaned over a silver map etched into the table's surface, one piece in particular, Egypt. "If we convince Pharaoh that Abijah is threatening the trade routes," whispered another, "he'll act. He always does, when coin is in question." A final voice spoke, low and icy. "Then let the boy king find out what it means to be surrounded." Later that week, Abijah stood on the palace balcony as a strange silence swept the horizon. Not the holy kind, the threatening kind. Zadok ran up the stairs, face pale. Pharaoh is on the move. Abijah blinked. "Egypt? Why?" "He says you're planning to cut off the southern trade road." "I never said that." "No," Zadok said grimly, "but someone did, and they said it in your name." Abijah turned and looked over the city of Jerusalem, its people walking calmly beneath the sky. "They don't know yet, do they?" "No." "Good," Abijah said quietly. "They deserve a day more of peace." That night, Abijah went alone to the temple. He didn't ask the priests to come, and he didn't dress in royal garments, just him and the altar. He knelt beside it, resting one hand on the cold stone. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't know who's plotting, or where the arrows will fly from next." He swallowed hard. "But I do know this. You raised me up in a crooked house. You gave me breath when no one else believed I'd matter. So if this is the moment I was born for, don't let me flinch." Behind him, footsteps echoed. Zadok again. "Should I gather the generals?" Abijah rose, slow but certain. "Yes, and this time we won't wait for the enemy to reach our gates." The next morning, a royal decree spread across Judah. Not of fear, not of retreat, but of faith. "Any man who still believes in the Lord," the scroll read, "meet me at the southern ridge. Bring no idols, speak no lies. We will fight, not just for Judah, but for the honor of the name above every name." And as the sun rose, Judah's faithful rose with it, farmers, craftsmen, priests, sons. Not perfect men, but willing ones. And high on the ridge where shadows couldn't reach, Abijah stood, eyes toward Egypt, sword at his side, faith in his heart. Because when you've been raised in darkness, and God still calls you his, you don't hide when trouble comes. You stand. The sun burned high over the ridge of Zemaraim, casting long, searing shadows across the battlefield. The cries of war rang out like thunder, echoing across the sky. But something else, something unexplainable, was stirring beneath it all. Abijah pressed forward, his sword flashing in the sun. His breath came fast. His muscles burned. Blood, his own and others, ran in streaks down his arms, but he did not fall. He couldn't fall. Because this wasn't just a battle for Judah, it was a battle for truth. Behind him, the priests of the Lord had gathered on a rock ledge with silver trumpets raised high. Their notes pierced the air like arrows of light. Each sound was a cry of remembrance, declaring that the God of Abraham still fought for his people. "Sound again!" Abijah yelled between clashes. "Let the Lord hear us!" A trumpet blast rang out, long, clear, unwavering. And in that moment, something changed. Across the field, King Jeroboam sat atop a chariot, wrapped in gold-threaded armor. He looked confused, angry, then unnerved. "Why are they still standing?" he growled. "They should have broken by now." A messenger ran up, out of breath. "My king, the eastern flank is retreating." "Retreating? No, press them harder, break them, overwhelm them." "But sir, the men say they hear thunder." Jeroboam narrowed his eyes. "There are no clouds." The messenger trembled. "They say it's the God of Judah." Jeroboam turned away. "There is no God who can stand against my army." But his voice shook, because deep down, he remembered stories too. Back on the ridge, Zadok dropped to one knee, clutching a deep gash in his side. "They're trying to circle us again." Abijah gritted his teeth. "Then we break through." He turned to his soldiers. "Do you believe our God is still with us?" "Yes, my king," they cried, voices rough with dust and faith. "Then charge, not because we're stronger, but because we're chosen." And with that, the men of Judah surged forward like a river crashing through stone. The enemy tried to hold, but something was different. Their formation cracked, their shields faltered, their confidence shattered like clay jars. And as Abijah's men drove them back step by step, the wind picked up again, this time sweeping across the battlefield like breath from another world. Then, without warning, light split the sky. It wasn't lightning. It was brighter, stranger, holier. Jeroboam's troops dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. Not because of the sword, but because they knew this wasn't Judah's victory, it was God's. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was silent. The enemy had fled, thousands of them, and not one had pierced the heart of Judah's line. Abijah stood in the middle of it all, covered in dirt and sweat, knees weak, eyes searching the heavens. Zadok limped to his side. "It's over." Abijah nodded slowly. "No, it's only just begun." Because this wasn't just about winning a war. It was about reawakening a people, and that awakening had only started. The morning after the battle felt like another world. Smoke curled upward from the burned-out torches. Broken shields littered the valley like discarded promises. The bodies of the fallen were being gathered with quiet reverence. Judah's own were few. but even those stung like a blade in Abijah's side. He walked through the camp with slow steps, his cloak dragging behind him, stained with earth and sweat. The people watched him, servants, priests, even hardened soldiers, each gaze carrying the same silent question. What now? Zadok caught up to him, still limping. You should rest, my king. I will. After Jerusalem hears what the Lord has done. Zadok tilted his head. You're going back today? Abijah nodded. I have a message to deliver, and not just to the people. By the time they reached the city gates, crowds had already gathered. Rumors of the victory had moved faster than riders. Children ran alongside the royal caravan, waving branches. Women wept and clutched the hands of their sons. But Abijah didn't pause for celebration. He headed straight for the temple, not the palace, not the throne room, the temple. He threw open the great wooden doors and stepped inside, where silence clung to the walls like sacred smoke. The priests inside turned surprised. He walked forward, dropping to his knees in front of the altar, hands trembling. Lord, you did it. You did what you promised. Not because we deserved it, but because you are faithful. Zadok entered behind him, standing near the doorway. The people are ready to crown you with more power than your father ever had. Abijah looked up at the glowing golden lamps. Then they're not ready at all. Zadok blinked. My lord? Abijah rose slowly. They think strength means more soldiers, more cities, but real strength is staying faithful when no one else will. He turned to Zadok. We'll clean out the idols, every last one, from the hills to the hidden chambers. I will not rule a kingdom that forgets God. That night, Abijah summoned his council. The wealthiest nobles, the most powerful commanders, his own family. He stood in the center of the marble floor beneath a bronze lampstand shaped like an almond tree. I have called you here, he said, voice calm but unflinching, because this is the last day Judah will bow to false gods. The room stirred. A noble named Sariah rose slowly. With respect, your majesty, those gods, they keep the peace. They comfort the people. You saw what happened in the north when Jeroboam pushed too hard. Abijah walked forward. I saw what happens when people forget who made them. He pointed to the man's gold pendant, an idol carved with animal faces. Tomorrow, that idol burns, and every other like it. There was a gasp. Another noble stood. That will divide the people. Abijah nodded. Then let the division begin. Let it begin with truth. The next day, Judah woke up to the sound of smashing stone. Idols were pulled down from hills. Shrines were torn from secret rooms. Even in the palace, statues were melted and tapestries with forbidden symbols were burned in the courtyard for all to see. Some protested, some wept, but many watched in silence. And slowly, day by day, the eyes of Judah began to clear. That night, Abijah sat alone on the palace balcony, staring at the stars. Zadok joined him, setting down a plate of figs and bread. You know, Zadok said, you could have taken the easy path. You could have done what your father did, just keep everyone calm, keep the throne warm. Abijah didn't smile. And what would I be in the end? Another king with no heart? He leaned on the balcony rail. I was raised in shadows, Zadok, but the Lord still saw me. He looked toward the temple, glowing faintly in the distance. and I will not waste the light he gave me. The days following the idol purge were anything but peaceful. Not everyone celebrated the changes. Whispers of rebellion stirred like coals under ash, and one whisper grew louder than all the rest. Maacah, the queen mother, Abijah's own grandmother. She had ruled from the shadows longer than most remembered, pulling strings, funding temples to Asherah, and using her charm like a net. Her power wasn't in the crown she wore, but in the secrets she kept. Now she stood in the throne room, her silver bracelets clinking as she entered, chin held high. "You called for me, grandson?" Her voice was sweet, too sweet. Abijah rose from the throne, dismissing the guards. "Yes, I need to speak to you alone." Maacah arched a brow. "Alone? That's bold." "So was building an altar to Asherah in the royal garden," he replied. She didn't blink. People needed something to believe in. The goddess is kind. She gives fruit, rain, favor. Abijah stepped closer. She demands blood. She steals loyalty from the God who actually saved us. "Your father didn't mind," she said softly. "And look where that got him." The room was silent. Then Abijah's voice broke through, low and resolute. "Tomorrow, the altar comes down." Maacah's eyes narrowed. "You would shame your own blood, disgrace the woman who raised you?" Abijah's jaw clenched. "I would rather shame a queen than offend the Lord." The next morning, crowds filled the palace courtyard. Whispers danced on the wind. Was it true? Would Abijah really confront the queen mother? Guards surrounded the garden where Maacah's shrine stood, tall, carved, wrapped in silk and offerings. Abijah walked into the courtyard alone. Every eye turned to him. Maacah stood at the edge, lips tight, but her expression cracked when Abijah raised his hand and motioned to the soldiers. "Take it down!" Axes swung. The wood cracked. Silks tore in the wind. Gasps rose from the crowd as the sacred pole collapsed to the ground, splintered and defeated. Maacah's crown slipped from her head. Abijah picked it up, not with anger, but with sorrow, and set it on the temple steps. He faced the people. No one, not even family, stands above the Lord. That night, the city was quiet. Not because of fear, because of awe. Children whispered about the young king who honored God more than gold. Fathers told their sons, "This is what it means to lead with courage." And in the temple, the priest lit a special lamp, a tribute to the light returning to Judah. Zadok met Abijah by the gate. "You did what your father never dared," he said. "You stood up to the shadows inside your own house." Abijah didn't speak right away. Then slowly, he whispered, "It still hurts." Zadok nodded. "The best obedience always does." Abijah looked up at the stars, just as he had when he was a boy on the rooftop. "Then let it hurt, as long as it brings us back to God." The rain came without warning. Heavy drops slammed against the palace roof as thunder rolled like war drums across the hills of Judah. Inside, the torches flickered low, casting strange shapes across the stone walls. Abijah stood at the window of his chamber, hands clasped behind his back. His body ached more these days. His steps were slower. But his heart had never been more awake. Zadok entered quietly, carrying a folded cloth. "You've been standing there all night, my king." Abijah didn't move. "There's a storm coming." Zadok nodded. "Yes, a real one, and maybe another one too." Abijah turned, eyes tired but focused. "How long have I reigned?" Zadok replied, 3 years, and every day counted." Abijah smiled faintly. 3 years doesn't seem long, but I think I did what God asked." "You did more than most," Zadok said. "You turned hearts. You silenced idols. You reminded the people who they belonged to." Abijah sat down slowly, fingers rubbing his temples. "I wonder if my son will remember." Zadok hesitated. "You mean Asa?" Abijah nodded. "He's watching. He always has been. Quiet boys see more than we know." A gust of wind rattled the shutters. Zadok stepped closer. "Will you bless him?" "Yes," Abijah whispered, "but not with gold or titles. I'll bless him with truth." He motioned for Zadok to open the cloth. Inside was a worn leather scroll, an old prophecy passed down from David himself. "Give this to Asa when I'm gone. Tell him to follow it closer than I followed anything." Zadok's eyes filled with quiet sorrow. "Is it time, my king?" Abijah didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the roof, the place he had once snuck away to pray as a child. "Take me there." That night, Abijah was carried up the steps by 2 guards. The sky was wild with lightning. And in that sacred place above the noise of the world, he knelt once more, just like he did when he was a boy. "Lord," he said, "I have no altar here, no incense, no offering, only my heart, and it still beats for you." Silence followed. Then the wind shifted, and a calm settled, as if heaven itself whispered back, "That's enough." Abijah closed his eyes. "Remember Asa." By morning the storm was gone. So was the king. But in the hills of Judah, a boy named Asa stood at the edge of the palace wall, the scroll of David pressed to his chest, and a fire beginning to stir in his spirit. He didn't wear a crown yet. But the kingdom had not been left empty, because one man's courage had cleared the path, and God, who sees in the shadows, was still writing the next chapter. The throne room was silent. For the first time in years, the sound of Rehoboam's voice and then Abijah's voice was gone. No commands, no corrections, no king. But there, standing just below the steps, was a boy. Asa, still young, still unsure, but his eyes were steady. Zadok approached him slowly. "The council waits for your decision, my prince." Asa looked up at the empty throne. "I'm not ready." Zadok smiled. "Neither was your father, but he let God lead, and now he'll lead you." Asa didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out the scroll his father had left him, the one worn at the corners, with David's psalms written in fading ink. He read a line softly. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" He closed the scroll and took a deep breath. "Bring the people," Asa said. "It's time they heard the truth." That afternoon, in the very same valley where Abijah once shouted into the wind, Asa stood before the people of Judah. He was smaller than most of the men around him. His voice cracked once or twice, but no one laughed. Because something had changed, because courage Even quiet courage leaves a mark, and Asa had inherited something stronger than a kingdom. He had inherited conviction. "My father stood for the Lord," Asa said, "even when his house was broken, even when the odds were against him, even when no one else believed." He looked out at the crowd. "Now it's my turn." He pointed toward the temple. "Tear down every idol. Burn every hidden shrine. From now on, Judah belongs to the Lord." A roar erupted. Soldiers raised their fists. The elders bowed their heads. And in heaven, the God who sees the heart smiled. Because this was never just about thrones or battles. This was about legacy. About a young boy who once prayed in shadows, growing into a man who brought light. About a son who watched, a prophet who believed, and a king who never stopped listening. And so the story of Abijah ends not in defeat, but in legacy. He didn't have the longest reign or the most impressive palace, but he had something far greater. A heart that still belonged to God. And through that heart, through whispered prayers and bold declarations, Judah found hope again. Because God sees your heart even when you're surrounded by evil. And that changes everything.